When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD experts presentation titled ADHD Across the Lifespan, How Symptoms Evolve and Fluctuate. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Maggie Sibley. Dr. Sibley is a professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine and a clinical psychologist at Seattle Children's Hospital. She also serves as secretary of the American Professional Society of ADHD and Related Disorders, and she's an associate editor at the Journal of Attention Disorders. Dr. Sibley is the author of Parent-Teen Therapy for Executive Function Deficits in ADHD, Building Skills and Motivation. It wasn't so long ago that clinicians and researchers believed that ADHD only affected children, and that by the time these children reached adulthood, they outgrew the condition. We now know that ADHD accompanies most people throughout the lifespan, and that adults are among the fastest growing group of new diagnoses. We also now know that the way ADHD symptoms affect daily living can change throughout a person's life. In today's webinar, Dr. Sibley will explain how ADHD symptoms can wax and wane over time, due in part to certain lifestyle changes and triggers. And she'll discuss what the latest research findings mean for professionals and for adults who have or suspect they have ADHD. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Play Attention. Boost your brain power at any age. Got ADHD? No worries. Keeping your mind sharp and focused is key, no matter how old you are. That's why Play Attention offers a personalized program to boost your executive function and keep your brain buzzing across all stages of life. With research backed by Tufts University School of Medicine, Play Attention helps you level up your attention, emotional regulation, and overall performance. Its NASA-inspired technology gives you the custom support you need, whether you're a kid, a busy professional, or rocking your golden years. And guess what? They have awesome family plans too. Click the link on screen to take Play Attention's ADHD test or schedule a consultation to kickstart your journey to sharper focus and a better quality of life. Call 828-676-2240 or visit www.playattention.com to learn more. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Maggie Sibley. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading this discussion.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about a very interesting and relevant topic, which is whether ADHD can change in folks over time. And we're going to start out by asking ourselves whether some of the interesting trends in ADHD help seeking that we've seen in the past few years could be related to changing ADHD within people. So the first slide you guys see is a graph that shows an uptick in people who are seeking help for symptoms in response to stimulant medications. And what we saw in some data released from the CDC and from the DEA in the last couple years is that coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a big spike in people who are seeking care with stimulant medications. In this first slide, we see data released in a report by the DEA showing that the main folks who are responsible for this spike are people kind of who are more middle-aged and women versus men, not necessarily children. Then we see in data released from the CDC, again, that it's really folks who are kind of from the young adult period through the middle adult period, and then again, more women than men that are sort of responsible for this uptake in people who are seeking help through medication for ADHD in the last few years. We can look at some claims databases. This is from people's health insurance. And again, what we see, the green line is children, and the blue line is sort of young to middle-aged adults. And we see, once again, that it's not children that are responsible for this increase in help seeking with ADHD. They've actually seen a drop over the last few years. It's actually sort of these middle-aged, young to middle-aged adults that are kind of driving this trend. So this is interesting, right? And so we aren't the only ones who've noticed this. The popular media has noticed this. So from the New York Times, how to tell the difference between ADHD and regular distraction, how do I know if I have adult ADHD, the age of distract depression. A lot of people are kind of wondering, what's happening? Why are more people looking for help with ADHD? From the Washington Post, feeling distracted, here's what to consider besides ADHD. An ADHD diagnosis has reframed years of thinking I was too much. ADHD is an illness, not a lifestyle. Don't punish people for it. From Time Magazine, what's driving the demand for ADHD drugs like Adderall? From The Guardian, ADHD has become an identity, not a disorder. We need to talk, a new way to talk about it. So a lot of interest in this. Why are so many adults being diagnosed with ADHD? The full story. The Lost Girls, chaotic and curious women with ADHD all have missed the red flags that haunt us. Big public conversation about this. So why is this happening? Well, I think we have some open questions, right? One possibility is that new people are developing ADHD for the first time. Another is that people who maybe outgrew their ADHD as children are now sort of experiencing a resurgence in their ADHD. So is that possible? How about, are we just getting a little bit more broad and expansive in terms of our definition of ADHD? And is that leading new people to sort of find a home there in terms of their difficulties? I think all of these three hypotheses are possibilities. And so what I'm going to do today is walk you through the data a little bit and let you draw your own conclusions about what you think might be going on. So let's start with the first one. Could new people be developing ADHD? So one interesting piece of data came from U.S. Census data. This was published in the New York Times last fall. And they said that on the census, there was a big jump around the same time. We see it around kind of 2021 in this orange line of people who answered a census question that they were having trouble remembering, concentrating, or making decisions. So more than in previous years. Now, I want to just make one quick caveat. If we're talking about the possibility here of late onset ADHD, that is different from late identified ADHD, right? So late identified ADHD means you always had it, but for some reason, no one realized it was ADHD until you were older. Late onset ADHD would mean you never had difficulties until a certain point in time, and suddenly, spontaneously, you had an onset of ADHD. So the data we looked at on the previous slide from the New York Times, you see that spike. It almost suggests that something more like late onset ADHD, people for the first time are having these difficulties. So what do we know about the possibility of that phenomenon? People could spontaneously develop ADHD. Well, in 2015, 2016, so almost 10 years ago now, some big studies came out of a few countries globally, New Zealand, the UK, and Brazil, and they reported in these big birth cohort studies with lots of people in them that there was a phenomenon of adults who were self-reporting ADHD for the first time, but as children, when they had data on them when they were younger, they were not any indications that those folks had ADHD. So they raised the question that actually there could be a big percentage of people who are developing ADHD. In fact, what they found in their studies was that 3 to 10% of the entire population appeared to have late onset ADHD, and that most adults who had ADHD had no symptoms in childhood, and that most children with ADHD were no longer experiencing ADHD as adults. So does this jive with what this audience sees typically? Ask yourself that. Well, it turns out that this didn't jive with what a lot of professionals thought they had been seeing. And some follow-up studies kind of were able to kind of dispel this issue that they're raising about widespread late-onset ADHD, possibly 10% of the whole population. So what happened here is that these studies only used a questionnaire, a checklist of ADHD symptoms. They didn't provide a full diagnosis. So they didn't look to see if maybe another explanation could be there for the symptoms, right? So we all know, let me give you some examples. People who are really anxious, they might also say yes to some ADHD symptoms, but it's not ADHD that's causing those symptoms, it's their anxiety. Or people who use a lot of marijuana might be having troubles with things like memory, or having trouble with their processing speed being slowed down. But and they might say yes to some ADHD questions because of that. But that isn't ADHD that necessarily caused that, right? It would be the symptoms that one gets from heavily using a substance. So we sort of dismantled these studies a little bit with that. There were some other things people criticized, saying, you only looked at me once in childhood. A lot of other years in childhood, I was having a hard time, right? And so there was a lot of sort of caveats to that. And what we did in the MTA study, which is a big study on ADHD done in the United States in the 90s, and it followed kids into the 2000s and the 2010s, and I'm a part of this study. We published a paper right after those 3 international studies came out. And we said there's another way to look at this. And we have data on actual diagnoses of ADHD and not just checklists. So here's our question. Let's go see if we can find anyone in our data that genuinely seems like they did not have ADHD in childhood, but they developed it as an adolescent or an adult, right? So we have really deep data on these folks. A reminder to you that the symptoms of ADHD are not just, having enough on a checklist. You also need to have symptoms. In order to have ADHD, you have to have symptoms prior to 12. You have to have symptoms in multiple settings. The symptoms have to cause you impairment in your life, and the symptoms shouldn't be explained by another condition. And so in our study in the MTA, we looked at about 240 adults who did not have ADHD in childhood, but were part of a control group on a big study on ADHD. And so there was a lot of information on these folks in terms of questions about ADHD, even though they didn't have it, because they were a control group for a study on ADHD. And in this group, they were followed 9 times between about age 10 and about age 28. In this group of people, we found that lots of people said yes to ADHD symptoms on symptom checklists. But when you really pared it down, almost none of those people actually had ADHD. A lot of them didn't have impairment, which meant that they had some symptoms, kind of part of their personality, but those symptoms were mild. They weren't causing them any problems in their life. A lot of people, if you looked closer, you did find childhood ADHD. And so, if you dig deep, there were indications it was there. The folks just hadn't gotten diagnosed. And then if you started to look for symptoms that may have specifically arisen because of another condition, you ruled out a lot of people as well. So there's a lot of reasons people say yes to symptoms on an ADHD checklist that are not ADHD. And it's the job of a professional who's expert in diagnosing ADHD to kind of do that detective work and figure out what's really causing a person's symptoms collaboratively with the person. They should do that detective work together. And so in the end, there was very few people who met that definition, but there were a couple people. What we saw most often when there was some sort of late onset was that the onset was in adolescence and not in adulthood. And so here's an example of a real case. The black lines are inattentive symptoms and the red lines are hyperactive impulsive symptoms, and we're looking at it over time. So in the first set of points, the person's 9. In the last, this particular person is 24. And the different lines report different reporters. So there's P for parent, S for self-report, T for teacher. And the bold lines are adding up everyone's symptoms together. So you can see that this particular person did not seem to have any symptoms at age 9. By the time they were 10, there was a few symptoms emerging. Those symptoms sort of slowly escalated over time. And by the time the individual was a teenager, they were having some difficulties. They got heavily into substances, multiple substances throughout their young adulthood, and you saw the symptoms sort of ADHD be prominent as the person got older. So this is an example of someone we saw. again, there's also substance use there. So is that part of why the symptoms are there? We can't know for sure, but these are the types of questions that, arise for people.
Hey, Prime members, are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Here's another example. We found 2 people who possibly had adult onset ADHD, but here they were never clean. So here's a person who actually kind of met it in adolescence. You can see that, when they first met in adulthood at age 21, it wasn't the first time they had ADHD symptoms. It was just when they were younger, those symptoms were attributed to anxiety. And then they did better for a while. And then later on, they had symptoms again, but without anxiety. So, was that earlier symptom actually ADHD mistaken for anxiety? We don't know for sure, right? But we didn't find any examples of people who just never had ADHD symptoms and suddenly did. So we sort of concluded out of that study that the most common reason that people would spontaneously develop ADHD symptoms when they're older with no history when they're younger is probably something else causing those symptoms that's not ADHD, which is kind of conceptualized as like this long-standing chronic disorder that maybe it's not as severe when you're younger. Maybe, you're able to compensate for it in certain ways, but at least if you look back, it feels like it was there. And that narrative of it kind of being there your whole life, rings true to some degree. So out of the kind of late onset controversy of the 2016, 2017 era, it sort of feels like we could say about our current data of more help seeking for ADHD that it's probably not late onset ADHD. That doesn't seem to be a valid phenomenon. Mostly because we know that most people who say yes to ADHD on symptom checklists, eventually don't meet criteria for ADHD. So they're saying yes to that symptom, right, on the census data, but we don't actually think it's probably ADHD that's causing them to say yes to that symptom. So that, that we have a question mark there, but at least we're going to clear the air on this one possibility. Okay, so here's another question. Could ADHD be resurfacing in people who had childhood ADHD, for lack of a better word, seem to have recovered from it and then, have it again? So the same data set, the MTA study, where we followed sort of 600 kids with ADHD from when they were very young, 8 years old-ish, until their end of their 20s. Again, we had 9 data points on these kids. So we were able to kind of ask this question of whether people would have ADHD symptoms that could go up or down over time. And so could there be someone who kind of outgrew it for a while and then it comes back? And maybe that explains things. So in the MTA study, the first thing we did was we needed to come up with a definition of what it means to be fully remitted or recovered from ADHD, if there even is such a thing, right? So what does that look like? So we worked on that for a while. And we kind of said, all right, we can't say that a person is completely clear from ADHD. As I'll show you in a later slide, the average person actually has a few symptoms of ADHD. We're going to say they have 3 symptoms or less. They aren't really having any impairment, and they finished all their ADHD treatment. And if a person looks like that, we'll say that they're kind of remitted. And then we took that definition and we applied it to all 8 follow-up points in the MTA data, which are on average about 2 years apart, again, from about age 8 to about age 28. And then we'll see, are there people who get better and get worse over time? Is there ups and downs? So first way we looked at this data, if we took every single year of the study individually, and you can see in the first column how many years after the initial start of the study was the data collected, in the second column the average age of the participants, and then look at our third column. So here we see, there we go, here we see the percentage of people in that year that appeared to be doing really well and kind of fully remitted from their ADHD. Okay, so as you get older, it's a greater number of people, but it never really gets more than like 18%, right? It's always kind of under 20%. So there's not a lot of people with ADHD who seem to be outgrowing it in any given year. If you wanted to like deep dive deeper into this data, if you looked at the last column, you could see what percentage of people still met criteria for ADHD truly. and it's about 40 to 50% in any given year. The bigger thing is that there's a lot of people who kind of have had their ADHD get better, but it's not fully better, right? So they kind of have to have ADHD. We call that partial remission. And so a lot of people who are diagnosed as childhood kind of maybe experience that. But if we look at this data and string it together over time, the chart I just showed you is kind of like a snapshot, right? But if we string those snapshots together, we can kind of make a moving picture of what's going on for a person. So in our study, everyone had ADHD in childhood in this particular group that we were looking at, right? But then if we took a look a little bit more closely, really about 30% of the sample at any point in time remitted and did better. Okay, so about a third of people with ADHD will have a period where they're doing very well and technically wouldn't meet the criteria, if sat in front of a clinical psychologist for one reason or another. And among those who did get better for a while, though, almost 2 out of 3 would go back to having a recurrence of their ADHD later. So it's a very small amount of people who sort of get better and then stay better, for many years. So that does sort of make us think, maybe there were people who got better and then something happened and they kind of had things get worse for them again. So when we looked at this across the whole sample, we saw a few things. So first of all, only about 10% of the people, 9% actually, we really could consider like recovered, which meant they got better at some point in the study and they stayed better for the rest of the study. And so that is a minority of people with childhood ADHD. There was also a group that's similar in size, about 10%, who had ADHD every single year of the study. So it's also pretty rare to consistently meet criteria for ADHD every year. That means that you might be more severe than the average person with ADHD. And then there's this bigger group who's kind of most people who their ADHD kind of goes up and down, right? It's 64%. So there were some years where they met criteria and there were some years that they didn't, whether it was full remission or partial remission in the in-between years. Some of them got really better and some of them kind of got half better, right? And then we had like 15% that got half better and stayed half better. So if you think about it that way, there is variety in how people's ADHD expresses over time, but most people are going to experience ups and downs according to this study. And this is what one real person looks like. So this is a real case where you can see, again, the graph set up the same way as that other one I showed you. Black is inattentive symptoms. Red is hyperactive impulsive. We've got different raters in there and dotted lines, and then the overall, if you add them up, in the solid lines. And you can see this person clearly had 2 very good periods of their life from age 9 to age 24, where they were doing a lot better according to everyone. They weren't having impairment. We also required that they were not currently taking medication or receiving any treatment for their ADHD in order to be considered fully remitted in this study. So that means that these folks are doing very well on their own during that time. Interesting, right? So everyone immediately says, okay, well, what predicts, when you do better and when you don't do better? Still don't have this clarified from a research standpoint, although it's very interesting to see the ideas crowdsourced from online on this, right? So, researchers like me want to kind of take all your ideas and see if they hold up in data so we know who they apply to and who they don't apply to. I think all ideas are valid, but some apply to only certain people, right? So it's interesting to kind of see those patterns. So could it be stress levels, more highly demanding environments, lifestyle factors, big life changes, loss of support? What else, right? That was the question at the beginning of this this presentation. So yes, I'm actually about to publish a paper. It got accepted. It's going to come out on this topic, which is going to be interesting. I'm going to save a little of that, but I'll tease you that there is a relationship with demands, which is kind of interesting, that you'll get to learn more about when the paper comes out. So come back to our trends from the pandemic, right? It could therefore be the case that people who have a history of ADHD but were doing better had their ADHD triggered by something related to the pandemic. That could be true. So that's interesting. Okay, last possibility. Are we actually just becoming very inclusive about who can have ADHD? And there could be different reasons that's happening. That's something we have to explore, right? Are there more people meeting criteria for ADHD, or is the diagnosis itself becoming broader and allowing more people in? So what can we conjecture about this? All right, here's some Google Trends data where you can see about people Googling ADHD. And it starts in 2012, and it goes all the way through 2022 into 2023. And you can see the start of the pandemic is right here. I also put for your interest the launch of some of the big online ADHD service delivery companies on here. And you can see that sort of the pandemic hits for about a month, service drops, and then it slowly, steadily rises over the kind of years coming out of the pandemic. And this is just people's public interest in ADHD measured by how often ADHD is Googled. So there's higher interest in awareness of ADHD during this time. Okay, so you can see the same basic trend on TikTok. What TikTok tells us that Google doesn't is who's, interested in this content, and we see it's mostly young and middle-aged adults from TikTok. Okay, which is the same age group that is coming in for more treatment, right? That's interesting. So you could ask yourself, is it just that there's increased public interest in ADHD, leading more information about ADHD to be online, leading to more people to recognize that they have ADHD, leading to more people looking for help for ADHD? This is very possible, right? Okay, is this good? Is this bad? Well, I don't think it's either. The good things about it is that it's great if somebody who has been struggling and then they don't understand why, and maybe it makes them feel kind of bad about themselves, figure it out, and it makes sense, and they can connect with other people like them, and that's very powerful, right? And that may be particularly applicable to people from certain identities. So, for example, we see that women are often not recognized as having ADHD till later. People who are from ethnic, racial, minority backgrounds, adults in general who just were missed in childhood, regardless of their demographics. People who had barriers to care, right? People who lived in rural areas, for example, and didn't have a mental health specialist in their town. So that would be a really good thing about this. Here's what's challenging. It's not clear to what extent all self-diagnoses are accurate. Some may be, some may not be. And so is there increased help seeking by people who have ADHD like traits, but not necessarily the level of symptoms of impairments we would have classically required in order to give a diagnosis? This is a question mark. I don't know the answer to it. It's something for you all to think about. Let me just clarify why this possibly could have happened. So ADHD is not a yes-no category. It's actually a continuum. If you look across lots of studies, if you look at genetic studies and look at studies of genetic load for ADHD, it's on a continuum. It's a normal curve, like the picture on the slide. And there's no biomarker test for it where you can just sort of say, yes, no, do you have ADHD? It's like a lot of other things in medicine, hypertension, obesity. It's not yes, no. They make cutoffs for these things, but it's not yes, no, do you meet the definition of obesity? It's, we all have, different places on that continuum. And, why even use a cutoff? Why even make a diagnosis? So, it's an interesting question. Here are the arguments that people would make for that. It helps us make decisions. Who's eligible for treatment? Should it be anyone who just wants the treatment, or should it be only people with certain level of severity? Same thing with accommodations at school or work. Should it be anyone who wants those accommodations, or just people who are demonstrating clear difficulties without them? With third-party payers, should anyone be able to be reimbursed for services related to ADHD symptoms, or is it just people who have a documented high level of difficulties? And then also, you have another camp who's raising questions about, hold on, like ADHD could be on shaky ground. Some people question that it even exists. If we start to sort of let it become a very loosely defined concept, we might actually undermine its ability to be taken seriously as a medical condition. So there's that piece of it too, right? And then from a societal perspective, some people will say, being able to have a clear diagnostic boundary allows us to sort of determine kind of like the above points, like who would need if we have limited societal resources, who should be most entitled to them. This is the arguments. So I diagnosed ADHD in my practice. A lot of you who are providers may also. There are certain people where it's very easy to diagnose ADHD. You meet them, you hear their life story, you give them some questionnaires, you talk to their family members, clear cut. Those people may be more likely to be on this sort of extreme end of the continuum, right? But then you have people in what we call this gray zone. You could probably defend that they had ADHD, and you could probably defend that they didn't have ADHD. And it's really tricky, if you're a provider, to decide how inclusive or how restricted to be for folks who kind of fall in that zone. So how do we deal with folks like that? People who maybe have some ADHD traits, but they're not so severe that that's an obvious diagnosis. Like some people in this audience I know are providers. You're wondering how severe does a person need to be for me to give the diagnosis? Well, interestingly, right, in English and North American society, we don't have language that we use a lot for ADHD-like traits that don't use the word ADHD. And the D in ADHD, stands for disorder, right? So we've already sort of labeled the entity as a disorder when lower levels of it might not actually be disordered. Actually, if you look at some interesting data, the average adult in the United States between the ages of 20 and 40 has 3 symptoms of ADHD. So most people have some symptoms of ADHD. This isn't something where you either have 0 or you have a lot. And the average adult above 40 endorses 2 symptoms of ADHD. So actually, most of the population has at least 1 symptom of ADHD. And so obviously, narratives of ADHD in our lives can be very relatable. 20% of people have a cluster of symptoms like ADHD, but we don't say that 20% of the population has ADHD because usually we have a stricter criteria for how severe you need to be. And you can see this sort of kind of friction in the public media, right, and in people's viewpoints. So, and it's an interesting friction. So from The Guardian, ADHD, the medical condition, providers are saying it has to reduce your quality of life, right? It has to be impairing. You have to have severe symptoms or you don't have it. But then what about folks who sort of feel like I have been fighting this for my whole life and I've got it under control and I don't have, these symptoms anymore because I've been able to kind of suppress them or work around them, but it is still a core part of who I am, right? Interesting question, the difference between ADHD as an identity and ADHD as a clinical diagnosis. And one thing that's been raised is, are we all starting to think we have ADHD because we have messaging all the time, sort of exposing us to this idea that any difficulties with concentration, attention, might be ADHD. So we saw this huge wave and trend of online ads about ADHD that started during the pandemic. I'm sure people in here saw them, right? I like to show you some. So, here's when you take Adderall, eat sugary snacks every 30 minutes. Some of them are funny. Again, messaging with the pill on it, right? More messaging with the pill on it. Interesting, engaging content, how rare is your ADHD type? 5 types of ADHD. Turning ADHD into a strength. Just relatable content about sort of feeling like, you may have ADHD and you don't realize it. Generic symptoms like being anxious, not being able to focus. Maybe that's ADHD. Being indecisive. Maybe that's ADHD, right? People with ADHD do experience all these things, but so do people without ADHD, right? And so that's the idea. And so maybe a lot of people are, having generic struggles and sort of now they're more likely to say, oh, I think that could be ADHD. So this is a possibility. I could do these ads all day, but I'm going to skip by some of them. Okay, so that's a possibility, right? Are people being primed to see their difficulties with ADHD now more because of ads or other messaging online? It's an open question. I don't have the answer to it. I want you all to think about it and talk about it, in the places you talk about these topics and think about it, because we all have to think about it together. So what can we conclude? Well, I think that there is an increase in self-recognition of ADHD symptoms, right? And that's probably contributed to increases in help seeking. We just don't know what percentage of these self-identified are accurate and what percentage are not accurate. We don't know. What are the implications of this for people who have ADHD or are questioning if they have ADHD? Well, I think, first of all, if you're worried you have ADHD because you kind of feel like you have a few symptoms, first of all, just know that having some symptoms is normal and it doesn't mean you have ADHD. Also, the severity of ADHD fluctuates over the years. So if you do have ADHD and you are experiencing severe symptoms, know that there is kind of this glass half full interpretation here where, your symptoms can really be not a problem for you. If you figure out kind of how to identify ups and downs and factors that promote, things getting better and what you need to do to help you cope. Late identification is common with certain individuals with certain identities, and that's important to know. So maybe if you have one of those identities and you're sort of questioning and you feel like you have these severe symptoms, there's a good chance that maybe you do have ADHD, and that is something that's good and healthy to question. And it's great to go to a professional and try to help work together to sort that out together. But we can say scientifically, at least, that it does not appear that late onset ADHD is a common phenomenon. So if you spontaneously develop these symptoms in adulthood, I would really be considering possible other explanations for them. A whole different presentation would give you lots and lots of possible explanations, but it's something to talk to your doctor about, because it would be unlikely that you just spontaneously develop those symptoms later and never had a history of them in one way or another. For professionals, some implications. So definitely putting the assessment of functional impairment at the forefront of your diagnostic process, right? Because there's going to be a lot of people out there with mild traits, maybe some distress, like they feel like, they're not living up to their own expectations because of those traits, but they aren't actually having impairment in their life. And so for those folks, maybe they meet criteria for otherwise specified ADHD, right? Which is sort of like a lighter version of ADHD that you can give the diagnostic code to folks. And maybe it's best to refer them for non-pharmacological care at first, right? And see if maybe just having some tools and tips and strategies can be helpful for them. And I don't just mean like CBT. I also mean ADHD coaching, for example, or meeting other people online that are kind of similar experiences and sharing content online that could be helpful to people. All this is really therapeutic and doesn't require you to go through all the hoops of proving that you have enough severity to justify medication. Also, monitor and reassess people with ADHD because we see it changes over time. So maybe someone's doing really well right now, building in yearly checkups with people is probably important to just sort of see how they're doing and if treatment needs to change as a result of how they're doing. If you think someone has sort of like a late onset presentation, spend extra time on the differential diagnosis with them because there's a lot more other explanations that for that particular person may be plausible than for somebody who does sort of have the childhood history. You can also consider, is it just light identified? Is it just that we missed ADHD in this person? And if that's the case, you really should try to document what factors were present that led to the delayed identification. So there is a narrative there that does make sense. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'm leaving something on the slide for you all. Here's what I'm interested in now. We have all this data on medication help seeking increasing in the pandemic, but I'm also wondering if non-medication help seeking was increasing kind of coming out of the pandemic. And has that led to kind of a big rise in ADHD coaching, which I think is going on. So one thing I'm alerting you all to is that if you are an ADHD coach, I'm partnered with the ADHD coaching organization that we're launching in September, a national survey of ADHD coaches to learn more about what's going on with that question from your lens. If you are an ADHD coach, if you want to click this QR code, it will take you to a website where you can put your email in, and then we'll send you the survey when it's released. So that's one thing. A couple other follow-up questions. For people who have had ADHD care from online companies that have now shuttered, and I think there was a scramble, right? And some people I know I talked to, are having experiences that they couldn't transition care because their primary care doctors were questioning the online diagnosis. What's the best option for continued care for those folks? That's another question we need to answer as a society. And then what coping strategies are most helpful to people with ADHD to help them live a happy and healthy life, right? We're always trying to figure that out. That's the constant question and struggle. to kind of document and put in a helpful place for people. So all of us kind of have to work together on whether you're a provider, a person with ADHD, whether you're an ADHD coach, whether you're a researcher, we all work together to share these answers from the different perspectives we have. So I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A period here, and I'll try to help with anything I can.
Thank you, Dr. Sibley. Those were great questions. Attitude would also like to know what people did for the online providers that have since shut down, and also what people find to be most helpful to thrive with ADHD. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Play Attention once more for sponsoring this webinar. I'd also like to share the final results from today's poll question. We asked, if you've experienced a change in ADHD symptoms over time, what was the most likely trigger? 25% said mental health challenges like stress and anxiety. Another 25% said hormonal changes. 17% said major life events such as a loss or divorce. 12% said transitioning from one life stage to another. And 12% said either physical health changes or other external factors. Now to your questions. Dr. Sibley, as you might imagine, we had lots of questions around hormonal fluctuations and ADHD. People say their ADHD symptoms were much more intense, for example, during and after pregnancy and during menopause and perimenopause. And they're asking, what's the connection?
Thank you for asking that question. What an important question. All of you are experiencing very valid observations. Here's the bad news. No one has wanted to fund research on this. And so while we can say clinically that this seems like what we're seeing on the provider side too, we don't have data, big, good, solid data to kind of give you the rundown about what's happening, from a science lens. So, a lot of us are really interested in this topic. There is definitely a link between hormone levels and cognition. That's been shown. So yes, that is totally valid. And also with reward sensitivity. So how much you feel like you want to go after immediate gratification versus like delayed gratification in different hormonal states. So a good example is, do you feel like you want to go on your smartphone and just get immediate gratification, when you're at a certain part of the menstrual cycle versus another? That's kind of what I mean. So we have to uncover that more. It helps for people to share their experiences so that we have sort of like that lens to look at this from as well. But yeah, we don't know because it's the menopausal transition. It's, across the phases of pregnancy and after childbirth. And then it's also during the menstrual cycle that we are kind of aware that there's something going on, but don't have good data on it yet. So that's the answer.
Okay. Yeah. We also have questions around lots of people and women in particular say that they were diagnosed at midlife. And they're asking, what should I keep in mind as I age with ADHD?
Yeah, that's a great question also. I think that one thing that becomes challenging is that you will probably experience both the effects of ADHD and the effects of age on your cognition. So it's kind of like a double whammy, right, as you get older. Again, this is another area where we think there needs to be research. And for some reason, the funding agencies are not as interested in this topic. I hope that changes. The federal government is starting to pay more attention now in the U.S., so that's good. Actually, I think Attitude, you all had a poll a couple years ago that I saw where people were saying that kind of that 50s, 60s sort of encroaching on sort of the end of middle age, the beginning of like late adulthood was the most challenging period for women with ADHD. So there's probably also a sort of postmenopausal piece of that, as I just mentioned as well. But again, I'm a researcher, so my job is to only tell you confidently what the data says. So I'm going to hold back a little bit. But I think, that's what you need to keep in mind is like also advocating and making your providers aware of your ADHD so that if there is sort of this like, oh, you're just forgetful because, you're getting older, that you can kind of advocate like, no, I do have this diagnosis. It's been, lifetime thing for me. And I think then also, like, when you get older, and it may be appropriate to screen a person who's older, maybe for some people listening, for their parents, right? Like screening for cognitive impairments related to older age. There's this big question of, well, is it really just sort of ADHD that's sort of getting worse with age? Or is it that the person has suddenly had cognitive difficulties that are specifically related to cognitive impairment of aging? And so being able to share that family history when you're talking with maybe who's going to be assessing your own parents to see if there could be a possible onset of dementia there. It's important to let them know, hey, we do have ADHD in the family.
Okay. Another question is, are certain aspects of ADHD refractory to treatment if diagnosed later in life?
Can you
refractory
get more
to
specific?
Well, so if you're diagnosed later in life with ADHD, are you more likely to have a harder time with effective treatment?
I don't think we have evidence that that's the case. When we talk about medication treatments, it seems like they are effective regardless of a person's age. And then when we talk about non-medication treatments, I think the really important thing is to find a provider, cognitive behavioral therapies or coaching. Find a provider that kind of can relate to your period of life or has experience working with people in your period of life, so that they can sort of help you accurately and effectively process what's going on for you. So I think always at any age, you want to find someone who's relatable to you.
Someone says, I see that you work with ABSARD. Do you have any insight as to when the adult ADHD diagnostic criteria will be released? And she wonders if this has more, if this is a factor in some of these trends that you had mentioned in the charts in your presentation.
Well, one thing that's really important for folks to know is that the ABSARD guidelines are going to talk about the best way to implement the DSM as it's currently written, but it's not going to rewrite the DSM because we do not have the authority to do that. So I want to make sure people are clear on that piece. So we aren't going to make new criteria for ADHD, but we're going to say what providers should be doing to do it well. As far as the timeline for those coming out, I can only say what's publicly known and available right now, but we are hoping to have a public comment period on a draft of the guidelines that's coming out later this year. And then so that'll be the first sort of next update that people will hear on that. And depending on how that goes, they may be out quicker or we may take more time to kind of go through those and make sure we're taking everything to heart.
So along those lines, someone says, how does ADHD present differently in children and adults?
One thing we know is that sort of the core areas of the brain impacted are pretty much the same regardless of what age you are. It's really just how they manifest in your daily life. So it's partially what our daily life is partially a function of how old we are, what culture we're a part of, where we live, what the demands on us are, et cetera. So all of those factors influence, does this person's ADHD come out at work? Does it come out with family members? Does it come out in their parenting? Does it come out in their driving, right? And so really it's less probably about age and more about just like what your context is. And I say that knowing that we have this like historical idea that ADHD reduces in severity as people age, but I think we're starting to dispel that. And it's not really about that reduction in severity as much as it is we weren't always looking for the places that ADHD was showing up in people who are older. And so we were saying, oh, they're better. But now we kind of realize, oh, no, wait, it was just showing up in a different place.
Okay. Someone asked if psychedelics can mitigate severe symptoms of ADHD.
I don't know the answer to that because there's no research on that topic. So it's an interesting question. I'd love to see someone do that study, but I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Someone asked, how can you, quote unquote, recover from ADHD? Isn't it a neurodevelopmental disorder that can't be healed?
I know. Isn't that an interesting question? It's such an interesting question that there is a group of people who have ADHD that both they and the people around them see that person, they perceive that person has outgrown it. And so it's a question of why do people feel that way, given that we're thinking of ADHD as a disorder that, is chronic. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. It's sort of like should always be there. And that's, I think, something we have to figure out, right? People are feeling like they have this valid lived experience of like, I've overcome it. Is it that they've just like really learned how to compensate really well? And so it's like, not an issue for them and they don't even perceive themselves that way anymore? Is it that they never really had ADHD to begin with? And so, we mistook them for having ADHD and then they grew out of it. Maybe they were just going through a lot of stressors when they were younger. Of course, right? Any research, you have to kind of like figure out like what's the real reason behind this trend. So I think there's more to ask there, more to figure out there, but there is a group of people who feel that way about themselves. So, we need to talk to them, I guess, and figure out exactly what's going on. What I can tell you from the paper that's about to come out is that those folks tended to have more protective factors in childhood. And so maybe there's something there where if you have a risk for sort of like genetic load for ADHD, but the right protective factors are in place when you're younger, that you can kind of get on a different track and maybe not really have it escalate to the full disorder, right? So I would be looking at that for my next research studies if I were to try to guess like what might be relevant.
We had a few questions around diet and nutrition and if they affect symptoms.
They probably do in some way. It's a really hard topic to study. So we know in general that diet, exercise, nutrition impacts cognitive health. And ADHD is definitely kind of all mixed up in cognitive health if you have ADHD. So it is possible that just by optimizing your cognitive health as a person with ADHD, by having a healthy lifestyle, that your symptoms, they still might be there, but maybe they feel like better for you. They feel more under control for you. So I would encourage people not to worry so much about do those things reduce ADHD, but just say, hey, if I have ADHD, of course I want to optimize cognitive health. Of course I want to lean into those things. But with all of the different, options out there that are often companies or, maybe they're trying to make money off of their products, it is important to sort of say, what's the evidence that this improves cognitive health in some way or another, and make sure that you're kind of choosing something that is the best option amongst your choices in terms of things that seem like they work.
Okay. We had a few questions around emotional dysregulation issues. What's the best way to deal with emotional dysregulation?
You know what? There's different types of emotion dysregulation, and it depends on exactly what that person's experiencing. So what I would encourage the person to do is to go get a good psychological evaluation if you have access to it, or try to, access some sort of help just understanding exactly where that emotion dysregulation is coming from, because the solution to that would be different. Some people do benefit from medications that help with that, but other people are able to learn coping strategies that help with that. Other people are reporting improvements, with lifestyle modifications or high levels of exercise, but it really just depends on exactly what the source of the problems you're having are, what the solution is. So you'd probably be best to work with a provider if you have access to one on sort of that. If you don't have access to one, obviously medication wouldn't be an option for you, but trial and error at some of those other options might help you kind of figure out for yourself, like what sort of creates the best version of you.
Okay, great. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so that has to be the last question. So Dr. Sibley, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with our ADHD community. And thank you to today's listeners. If you would like to access the event resources, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 518. The slides and recording are posted a few hours after each live webinar. If you're listening in replay mode, simply click on the episode description. Please know that our full library of Attitude webinars is available as a podcast. It's called the ADHD Experts Podcast, and it's available on all streaming platforms. Make sure you don't miss future Attitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.